Hello guys, and welcome back to this final audio player in Jetpack Compose series, hopefully. So we are going to create this UI using Jetpack Compose. If you want to see how we fetch this data and the whole architecture, check the playlist link in the description box below. Now, this UI is what we are just going to create here. As you can see, we can just click here and navigate to other items. And also we can just pause here and we can use this here to navigate back. Now, enough talking, let's go together and build something awesome. Okay, now here we want to fetch the data inside our storage, and in order to do this we have to get the permission first from Android because this is just a dangerous permission. So in order to do this using Jetpack Compose here, we have to use the Google Accompanied library. So we can just come here inside our build.gradle file, and here we have several dependencies which we are just going to use. So we can just add another dependency here. So we can just paste this implementation here, accompanied library, so that we can just use them. Okay, now let's sync here our project and get started. Okay, now let's navigate inside here our manifest file, and here also we are just going to declare the read external storage permission. So you can just put this, and here we are just using this Android permission.read external storage, and here I have passed in to be the max SDK vision to be 28. So for that case here, now we can just easily request our permissions. Okay, so now we want to request a permission whenever we enter or we open up our application, because our application solely depends on that permission. So if our user is not granted that permission, we have to request again and again. So in order to do this inside here our Jetpack Compose, the first thing we can just easily get the state or the permission state, because in Jetpack Compose everything is just inside the state. So we can just call this permission state. And basically here now we can just call remember permission state. So basically here now we want to pass in the permission which we want to request. And because we have already passed there, we have only one permission. So we can just call this manifest here, and you can use this manifest Android, and we can just call this we want permission and call the read external storage here. So if you could have multiple permission, could just pass in a list of permissions here. So for that case here, we have also to annotate this with @opt-in experimental API, because this is just an accompanied library. So for that case, they are always marked with this experimental permission API, for example here. Okay, now here we want to request our permission inside our, when we launch up our application, we are on the on resume state. So we want to request this permission, and in order to do this we have to use the lifecycle observers in order to see when we are going to be inside this on resume state. And for this case here, we can easily do this inside Jetpack Compose. So let's create a little room first here. So we can just create here a variable, and here we want to call this lifecycle owner, and basically here we can just call the local lifecycle owner. And we can use this .current here in order to get our lifecycle owner. So we want to add observer here, and we cannot add an observer inside here our composable, because this composable here will be recomposed every time when the state changes, and this is just going to add multiple observers. And for this case here, we have to use effect handlers. So we can just pass inside here a key, and for case here we have a lifecycle owner, and we can make this effect inside the lambda function here. So what we want to do here, we have to call the onDispose method, because this disposable effect is going to have onDispose method. So this onDispose function here is going to be called when this key has changed here, or we have just moved out of this composition, so that we can just free up the resources. So for our case here, we are just going to create the observer which we want to get it. So we can just call here a variable observer. And here basically now we can just call the lifecycle event observer. Okay, so here we have two variables. So we are just going to want to get the event here. So we can check here if we are just going to be inside the on resume. So we can just check here if this event is going to be inside the on resume here, event.onResume. And then we can just easily request the permission. So if we are in the on resume state here, we can just call the permission state here, and we can call here launch permission request. So here it's just going to handle for requesting permissions using this library here. And for that case here, now we can just create our observer. So we can just call this Lifecycle owner here, and we can call this Lifecycle, and we can add here our observer. And for that case, we can just pass in this observer here. Now for that case, we have added here observer. Now let's remove this observer when we are just going to be disposed. So for that case, we can just also call this Lifecycle owner.lifecycle, and we can just call this remove observer here, and we can just easily pass in the observer which we have created. So the good thing about this, we don't have to handle this composition because Jetpack Compose is going to recompose a lot. So for that case, we could add a lot of observers here, and when we leave the composition, we don't want to have these observers. So we are just going to call this on dispose effect if this key here has changed, or if this Lifecycle or this Jetpack, this composable screen has navigated to another screen. So we have moved out of this composition, and for that case, it's just going to remove this. So we can just easily handle here our request of permissions. Okay, now we want here to show the UI if and only if we have the permission to do so, because we cannot allow the user to play the application because we are just going to crash. So we can just check here. If we have the permission state, we can just call this permission.state and has permission. And for that case, we have been granted permission, so we can just show our UI. And else here, we are just going to show an error box that is going to tell the user that we do not have the permissions to show you the data. So we can just easily here create a box, and basically here now we can just pass in the content alignment, and we can just make this alignment center here. And basically here now we can just show a text, and we can just tell the user that grant permission first. So for that case here, we have told them that we do not have the permission to show you the UI. So just show us. So we can just handle here or show other things to the user. So for case, we're just passing this text here. Now here we can just call our view model here in order to get the data because we have our permission. Okay, now let's create here a variable, and we can just call this audio view model. And here we can just create using this view model composable function. And here we can just pass in the model class. So for case here, we can just keep this inside another line. So we can just pass in here the model class. And basically we can just use this audio. We can use this audio view model here, and we can just pass in the reference of this class.java here. So we have our view model, and also we want to get our audio list, and we can just easily call this audio view model.audio list. And because this is just a snapshot state here, it's just going to be observed by the Jetpack Compose. So whenever we change this, we can just easily recompose again. Now we want to create our screen here. So we can just easily come inside here our UI and inside here our audio. So we can just create here our home screen. Okay, now let's create here a new composable. And this composable here, we're just going to call this home screen here. Okay, so here we want to create our bottom sheet scaffold because we are just going to use that bottom sheet to display our player. So for that case, we can just call this bottom sheet scaffold here. And here basically we have to pass in the sheet content. And this class here requires us to pass in the opt-in. But I think if you are just using composable version 1.1.0, this is just going to be in a stable release. So for that case here, we have our sheet content here. Also, we can just pass in here the scaffold state. So we can just call this scaffold state. And here basically we can just call remember scaffold state. We can just call this bottom sheet scaffold state here. Okay, and basically here now we can just pass in here our scaffold state. So we want to create here our sheet content in order to be displayed here. We want to create our player. So for that case, we can just, and here we just create a new composable here. Okay, now let's call this bottom bar player. And this bottom bar player here requires us to pass in here several dependencies. So for case here, we want to get the progress because we are just going to show here a progress bar. So we can just call this progress, and this is just going to be of type float. The first thing which we want here. Also, we want to check the on progress change. and this is just going to return unit here. Also, what we want to do here, we want to get the audio which we want. Here we can just call this audio, and also here we want to check if this is audio playing, so that we can just change our state. So we can just call this is audio playing, and this one's just going to be of type boolean here. Also, we want to have the commands here, the on start, and we want also to combine here the on next. So we are just going to change this to be on next. Okay, now let's create here our bottom bar player now. Okay, so here is just our UI. So we have here the first content, which is just displayed inside a row, and this two content here just being displayed in a column format. So we are just going to have a column, a row here displaying these items here, and also another item inside the column. Okay, now here we want to create our column, and basically here now we have our first item. So we have to create a row here so that we can just display this inside a row. So we want to pass in here a modifier, and basically we want to pass in here a height. So we want to limit this to 56 dp here, because we don't want this to be taller than our content. So we're just passing this to be 56 dp. Also, we want to pass in here the horizontal arrangement, and basically here now we can just arrange space between here, because we want to arrange this in a space between, as you can see here inside our design. So we want this to have only a single space here, and also we can just make this to be pushed here to here. So that's why we are just using this space between here. And also we want this to be arranged in a vertically. So we can just call this vertical arrangement, and we want to align them alignment center vertically here. Okay, so inside here we have two things. So we have this information here about the artist and the playback, and also here we have the controller. So we can just create here a separate composable that is going to represent this thing here, and this is just going to be represented in another composable. So we can just come below here, and basically outside here we can just create a new composable, and we can just call this artist information. And here basically we want to pass in here a modifier, and also we want to get the audio so that we can just get the audio metadata. Okay, now let's create here a row that is going to hold up the artist information here. And what we want to pass in here, we want to pass in the modifier, and we want to provide a padding. And basically here we can just pass in a padding of 4 dp. And also we want to align this vertically, and we can make them to align center vertically. Okay, so as you can see here, we want to create this icon here. And as you can see, these icons here, we have several icons which we're just going to create. So we can just create a separate composable that we can easily reuse it to just to display different icons here. So we can just come below this and create another composable. And we can just easily call this player icon item. Okay, so here we can just pass in here several dependencies. So you want to pass in first the modifier, and we can just make this to be a default parameter and pass in here another modifier. And also we want to pass in here the icon which we are just going to be using. So we can just make this the image vector. And also we want to show if we are just going to use a border. So we can just call this border. And here basically we just use our border stroke, and this must be nullable. And for default we can make this to be null. And another case here, we want to get the background color. Okay, and here we can just use our material theme, and we can just use this on surface here to get the first default color. And also here we are just going to pass in the content color. So basically here now we can just use the material theme on surface color. So basically here we have to pass in the surface, not on surface. Okay, and also we want to have whether we can just implement this on click, because in some variables here we want to be able to click our button. Okay, now let's create here a surface that is just going to help us to define the attributes for which we want here. And here basically now we want to pass in the shape, and we want this to be a circular shape. Okay, also here we want to pass in the border, and we can just easily pass in the border which we have created here. And also we want to pass in here a modifier, and we can just make this modifier. And we can just invoke this on click here. And here the content color, we can just easily pass in here to be this color. And also we want to pass in the color, which is just going to be the background color. And for our case, we can just call this background color here, so that we can just easily pass inside here a color. Okay, now here we want to create another, and also here we want to clip this to be, and we can call this to be clip. And here we can just pass in here our circular shape. So we want when we click this to not create a rectangle, instead to create a circular shape when we show the ripples. So we're just using this clip in order to clip those to be inside a circular shape. Okay, now let's create here our button. Okay, now let's create here a box that is just going to help us to provide this data, and we can just pass in here the modifier. Okay, so we have here our padding of 4 dp. And here we want to provide the content alignment, and we want to align this center. And here basically we can just create an icon composable here, and we have to pass inside here our icon, and basically here we can just pass in to be null. Okay, so I think here we have finished to create an player icon item here, which we can just easily reuse and substitute with data which we want. Okay, now let's navigate inside here our artist information, and here basically now we can just create our player icon. So we can just call this player icon, and here basically we have to pass inside here our icon. So we can just call this icons, and we want to use the music note here to be our icon here. And also here we want to pass in a border. So we can just easily create here a border stroke. So we want this to have a width of 1 dp. And we can just pass inside here the color, and we want to use the material theme. And we can pass in here the color to be on surface. And for that case, we have our data. And we are not going to react for clicks inside this item here, because we are just not going to have this data. Okay, and inside here now we can just easily pass in a spacer, and we want to pass inside here a modifier, and we can easily pass in here a space of 4 dp. Okay, so we want to create this text here, and as you can see, these two text here are just inside a column. So we can just easily create a column and pass in these two text field here. And for that case, let's just create here a new column. Can create a little bit of space here. And here basically now we can just pass in our first text here. And what we want to do, we can just use this audio. So we want to modify this. We want to pass inside here the font weight. And we can just make this to be bold. Okay, also here we can just change the style here. So we can just use this material theme, typography, and we can just call this to be header 6, so that we can just make it to be bigger than the other text. Also, we want to see if the text could be bigger than the space available. So we want to just clip here. So we can just call this text overflow. And we want to clip. So basically it's just going to delete the data here if it's just going to be more than the items there. Also, we want to pass in here the modifier. So we want to make the weight here. And we can basically make this to be 1F here. So we have here our first text. And also we can just create here a spacer. And here basically we can just pass in a space of 4dp. Also, we can just create another text here so to display here our subtitle or the artist information here. So for our case here, we can just call this audio.artist. And here basically we can just pass this to be a normal font weight. Okay, so we want this to be, we can change the style of this. And we can just easily use here material theme .typography, and we can just use this subtitle 1 here to be a smallest subtitle here. Also, we want to pass in here the overflow. So if the artist name is going to be bigger, so we can just use this to be clipped. And we also want to make this max line here. Okay, also, and here we can just make this to be only a single line. So we can just make this max line. So that we don't want this to be wrapped inside the second line if the text is large. That's why we have provided this text overflow clip here, so that when we are just going to have more than one line here, we just clip the other text here. Okay, now let's just collapse this data here. And I think we have finished to create our artist information. So we can just come back here inside our bottom bar player here. So we can just pass inside here our artist information. And basically here now we can just pass in here our audio. And one thing which we want to do here is to pass in here a modifier. And basically here we want to provide a weight here. We want to provide this to be 1F, because here we are just going to have a lot of information and we don't want to push the other items here. So as you can see here, we want only this to occupy a certain place and not push all of this data away off the screen. Okay, now let's create here our media player controller, because we want to control this by play and pausing. So we can just create this inside another composable. So we don't want to clog all of the data inside a single composable. So for this case here, we can just create a new composable and we can just call this media player. Okay, and inside here we want to get several dependencies. So we want to get this is audio playing, so that we can just easily change the data. And we want also to get the on start command here and the on next, so that we can just navigate to a next item here. Okay, so here we can just use our player icon here. And basically here we want to pass in the icon. So here we want to check this. So we can just make this inside the next line here. And we can use here the if statement. So if it's audio playing here, what we want to do is to pass in the icons. And else here we want to pass in the default play arrow here, so that we can just play. Okay, so as you can see here, we are just checking if this audio is playing, we are just using this pause icon, and otherwise else we are just using this play icon. So you could try to animate this, but we can just leave it at ease because it's just a subtle changes here. And also here we want to change the background color of this, so we can just make the background color and we can just use the material theme. And we want to use the primary color, because as you can see here, this is just inside an orange color here. So this is just our primary color. Okay, so for that case here, we want to invoke the on start here. So we can just call this on start. And we can easily invoke here on start. Okay, also here we have another item. So we want to wrap this inside a row. So we can just place here Ctrl-Alt-J and we can just surround this inside a row here. Okay, so here we want to pass in the vertical arrangement so that we can just arrange them vertically. So we can just pass in here the vertical arrangement and we can make this to be center vertically. And also we want to pass in here the modifier. And we're just going to make this height to be 56 dp here. And also we want to add a little bit of padding and we can just add here a padding of 4 dp. Okay, so here we have the player icon and we want to add another item here. So we can just create a little bit of space here between these two items here, and we can just make this to be 8 dp. Okay, so we can just create a normal icon here, and basically here now we want to skip the next, so we can just call this icons, and we have this skip next here, and here basically we can just pass in to be null. Okay, so we want to pass in here also the modifier, so we can just call this modifier, and we can just make this item to be clickable. And basically here we can just call this on next item, and we can just invoke this so that we can just navigate to a next item. Okay, so I think here we have finished to create our media player controller. So we can just come below this and create here our media controller. Okay, so we can just put this in a different line here, and also here we want to check is audio playing, so we can just pass inside here is audio playing, and we can easily invoke here our onStart, so we can just call this onStart, and we can easily call here our invoke button, and also we can just make this to be inside the same line so that we can understand what it is when we just easily read our code. So we can just call this on next here, and we can call this on next dot. So I think here we have our information. So we have our artist information here and our media player controller. Okay, so also what we want to do here is to create this slider here so that we can just easily slide and move these items here. Okay, and this is just represented by using that slider inside Jetpack Compose. And this just take in two values here. So we can just pass inside here our progress. Okay, so we want to also set the value range. So here we can just call this value range, and here basically we can just set the values which we want. So for our case here, we want this to start from 0f until, so we can just add 2 dots here until to be 100f. So for our case, we have been calculating this inside our view model to make it a percentage wise. So we are just going to start from 0 to 100% here. So that's why we are just overriding this on value change here, and then this on value range here, and then this is just going to be reflected inside our UI by passing these collective values here. Okay, now I think here we have finished to create our bottom bar player. Okay, now we want to preview our data here. So before we do this, we can just create here a dummy data that is going to help us to aid for this data. So I have already created this dummy audio list here. As you can see here, I have created a list of these audios here. So you can just easily copy this, or you can just create your own here. Okay, so let's call this bottom bar preview. And we want to show here the background, so we can just call this show background. And we can just set this to be true here. And what we have to do here, we can just call here our audio player theme here. And we can just call our bottom bar. So here we want to make this 50f, and here is just, we are just going to release this, and we can just use this dummy data here. And we can use the first audio item, and is playing here. We can set this to be true. And I think we are just good to go here. Now let's come here inside our split view and see our data. Okay, so here is our preview. And as you can see here, we have our data inside this. Now let's fix this to be inside a column here. I think we have made it to be inside a row, so we can just easily. Okay, so here is just our slide inside this bottom bar player here, and as you can see here, we have just added inside a row here, so we have to remove this. Now let's try also to re-preview again and see. Okay, so I think now they are just spaced correctly here. However, as you can see here, we are just not taking this to this last position here. And we can just easily fix this by passing inside here this modifier here. Let's rebuild again. Okay, so I think this is just our item here. And as you can see, it's just correctly displayed. Okay, now let's just come back here and finish up to create our other items. Okay, now let's call this bottom bar player inside here our sheet content. And before we do this, we want here to set this to show this bottom bar player if our audio is not null. And for this case here, we can just create this and pass in this data which we want to use them inside our home screen here. Okay, so here we can just pass in a progress, which we are just going to use it, and also the on progress change here. And this we want to make it to be a nullable because this current playing audio could be null for the first time when we launch our application. And we want to get here the on start here on item clicked. And also here inside our on start also we want to pass in the audio. So we want to pass this audio back so that we can just play that audio. And here we want to display our on next, and here we are just going to make it this to return unit here. We return nothing and return a unit here. Okay, so I think here now we can just easily create our composable. Okay, now let's check here our current playing audio, and this if this is not going to be null. And we can just easily rename that to current playing audio. Okay, now here we can just call here our bottom bar player. And here basically now we can just pass in our progress. And here basically now we can just pass in the current playing audio. And here we want to invoke this to be on next, so we can just make it to be inside the same. So here we can just pass in this to be on next. Okay, also here we want to set the sheet pick height, so we can just call here the sheet pick height. And here basically now we can just animate this by changing it. So if this is just going to be, the audio is just going to be null, so we want to set the value to be 0. So we can just call this animated height. Okay, so here we can just use this delegate method by, and we can just animate dp as a state here. And here basically we can just easily change this. And we want to check if the current playing audio. So if this is just going to be null, so we can just pass in here 0 dp. And we can call this sheet pick height here. And for that case here, we can just pass in here our animated. Okay, now let's create a preview function that is going to help us to preview this home screen. And we can just come below this bottom bar player item here. And here we want to show the system UI. So for the case of progress here, we can just pass in 50F, and here we just pass in a null. And here is audio playing. We can just make this to be true. And here we can just pass in the dummy audio list, which we are just going to use. And we can just get the first item here inside our dummy audio list. And here the on start, we can just pass in an empty lambda function here. Okay, now let's re-preview again here our data. Okay, so here is just our bottom bar, so we can just come here to our design tab, and as you can see here, we have here our bottom player. So using this Android Studio Bumblebee, we can just easily interact with this composable. And as you can see here, now we can just easily slide this up here, and because we have not passed anything else here, we cannot interact with this. So now let's finish up our UI here. Okay, now let's navigate here inside our home screen. Okay, now let's create here a lazy column. And here basically we can make this content inside a lambda function. And here now we want to pass in the content padding. And basically here now we can just pass in the padding value here, and we want this to be the bottom sheet. So we want to pass in here inside the bottom, and then we can just pass in this to be 56 dp. Okay, so we are just passing this padding value here. As you can see here, this is just going to be a height of 56 dp when we finish up this. So we don't want this item to be hidden inside this bottom bar player here. So we want this to be giving this padding here. That's why we are just passing this bottom padding here to be 56 dp. Okay, so here we can create the items. And we can just pass in this items list here. And we can just easily pass our audio list. Okay, so we can just create here another composable that is going to hold up the audio item. So we can just create here a new composable. Okay, so now here we want to pass in the audio. So we want to pass in here the audio which we are going to use it. And also we want to pass in the on item click. And this is just going to be of type long here. Okay, so as you can see here, we are just going to create this item here, and we have here a simple card that is going to hold up these two data. And this data here, we have the duration here, and also we have the item here to be displayed about the music. Okay, now let's just come below here. Okay, now let's create here our card. Also, we want to pass in here the padding of 8 dp so that we can just send this data away here. Okay, and also we want to make this to be clickable. And here we can just call the on item click, and we can just invoke this function here. And we can just use our audio, and we can just pass in here the ID, which is just going to be the ID of the audio. Okay, and here we want to get the background color, and here we can just use the material theme. So we want to, as you can see here, this color here is just going to be different from this. So we can just easily use the material theme, and we can modify the item. So we can just call this material theme. And here basically now we can just use the surface color. And what we want to do here, we want to copy this, and we can just change the opacity here, which is just going to be the alpha here, and we can just pass in here 0.5f. Okay, so we want to create this data here, and this data just inside a row. As you can see here, they're just horizontally arranged, and also these two here are just inside a column here. Okay, now let's create here our row. And here we can just pass in the vertical arrangement. And we can just center this vertically here. Okay, so we want to display these two items here. So we can just make them inside a column. So we can just call this column here. And here we can just pass in here a modifier. Okay, so we want to provide here a weight so that it can just push this data. So we want this to be 1f here. And we can just pass in here the padding of 8 dp for our case here. Okay, so for this case here, we want to display our text, and here we can just create a little bit of a spacer first, and here we can just pass in here this to be 4 dp. Okay, and also we want to first create our first text, which is just going to be the display of the item display name. And here we can just use our audio, and we can just call this display name here. And here we want to change the style, and we can just use the material theme. And here we want to use this to be header 6 here to change the style. Also, we want to use this overflow, and here we can just easily clip. And we can just pass in here the max line to be 1. Okay, now let's create here another text. And here we want to use now the audio artist. So we can just use this audio.artist. we want to make this color here to be a little bit, as you can see here, this is just, it's going to be a little bit darker than this one here. And we can pass in this on surface, and we want to copy this color here, and we can just pass in this alpha, and we can pass this to be 0.5 f. Okay, so I think here we have finished to create our first text, which is just going to be this text here. Also, we want to create another text, which is just going to be at the left side here. And here basically we want to format our time, because our time we're just getting it to be a duration. So we want to format this to be in a certain style that a user can understand this, because here we're just getting an integer or a long value. So we cannot just display here this value. So we want to format this. So we can just create here a helper function that is going to help us to do this. And we can create here another private function. So this is just a normal function, not a composable function. And we can just call this timestamp. So you can just use any method here. So for our case, we're just going to calculate this to get the total seconds. So we can just call this total seconds. And we can use here a Kotlin flow function that is going to help us to convert this position here. So we want to take this position here, and we are just going to divide this by 1. So we are just going to divide this by 1 exponential 3. So this is just 1000 here. So that this is just going to be, it's just going to round this value here, which we are going to get to a nearest integer here, so that we can just use it. And for that case, we can just call this to int. Okay, so we can just get the minutes which we are going to have here. And we can just use this total seconds, and we can divide this by 60. And we can calculate the remaining minutes. And here basically we can just get this total seconds. Okay, so here we want to return now our data. So we can just check here if this position is just going to be less than 0. So we can just call this position here. Okay, so we are just going to return if this position is just going to be 0, we don't know the time, so we cannot format this. So we're just going to return this. So we are just going to pass in here a template that is going to help us to format this. So we can just pass in this to be D. So we can just call this to format. And here basically we can just call this minutes here, and we can just pass in here the remaining minutes. Okay, so you can just use this even if to display, for example, a progress when this is just going to be playing. So for our case, we are just going to use this for one-time event. And for that case here, we can just pass in here our timestamp duration. And we can just easily use the audio. Okay, and inside here now we can just pass in here a spacer. And here we want to get a spacer of 8 dp. Okay, so I think here we have finished to create our audio item. So we can just navigate here, and we can just call here our audio item. And here we can pass in here our audio. Okay, now let's preview here our item and see. Okay, now as you can see here, we have finished to create here our UI. And we have everything here. So even if we start here our interactive mode, and we could easily set this state here in order to change these items here. So I think they are just clickable. We have here our time, and we can just easily interact with this. So now let's create and finish up to hook up everything here inside our code. Okay, now let's navigate here inside our main activity. And here now we can just pass in the progress. So we are just going to use this audio view model, and we created this state from the previous video. So we can just get here the current audio progress. And we can just call here our audio view model, and we want to seek to a certain position. So we can just call this seek to here, and we want to pass in here the value, and we can just pass in this to be it. So when this value is going to change here, it's just going to reflect this current audio progress here and update our progress. And also here we can just check the audio is playing here. So we can just use our audio view model, and we can check is audio playing here, so that we can just change here our state if audio is playing or not. And here basically we can just pass in our audio list, and we have this current playing audio here, and we can call this dot value. Okay, so here we are just going to call this audio view model, and we can just call this play audio here. And here we want to pass in the current playing audio, and we can just pass in this to be it here. Okay, so inside here now we can just call this audio view model, and we want to play also the audio here. So we can just call this audio view model, and we can call play audio here, and we want to pass in here it. And for case here, this is just going to be the controller that is going to control here. So we have this controller here that is going to invoke this on start here. And also when we click this variable here, we want to play our audio. That's why we are just using this on item click here in order to invoke this audio to play here. Okay, so here we can just put in our on next, I think. Yeah. So we have here our on next item. So we can just use here our audio view model, and we can just call this skip to next, so that we can just skip to the next item. Okay, so I think here we have finished to create our view model and our UI. Okay, so this is just the moment of truth. Now let's try to run our application and see if we have any errors. Okay, so we are just getting here an error, and we can see here health activity must be attached to an health Android application. So, and then it's just giving us here, we have forgotten to add this inside our application class name. So we can just come inside here, our Android manifest file. And here now we can just provide a name. And as you can see here, we forgot to add this application class here. Now let's try to rerun again and see. Okay, now our app has launched successfully. Now we can just click allow here to allow that data. And here now we can just easily play this data here. Now let's try to click here. And we're just having here an error. We can just check here our log cut. And we can see that on custom action, we have problems here. So let's just navigate here inside our own service, and we can just come to this media player service here. And we can just navigate to this on custom actions here. And as you can see here, we forgot to add the super method. So we can just add this super method here, and we can just call these actions. And actually, let's try to rebuild again and see. Okay, now our app is launched again. And as you can see here, we have our application. But as you can see here, we have some problems here. We can try to fix them right now here. Our progress bar is not moving. And also this data here is just going to push these buttons here. And we can just easily fix this right now. Now let's jump inside here our code, and we can try to fix this. Okay, so right now here we can just navigate inside here our audio view model. And as you can see here, I have added several fix me here because we have problems which we forgot to implement here. So if you come here down below, we implemented this update playback here. So this one is just going to help us to update the slider there, but we forgot to implement this method here. So that's why we're just coming inside here, our fix me number 1 here. And basically here now we can just call that get. We can call this update playback here so that it can be updated here inside when we finish to connect this by using this service connection here. Another thing here which we have another problem here is just this current duration here. We are just initializing to a single value, and this for the first time this is just going to be 0. So when you navigate here, you can see that we implemented this to be a 0. So when we initialize like this, we are just going to get a 0 current duration here. So in order to fix this, we can just make this to return a long. And instead here, we can just provide a get function here in order to get this value. So whenever we want this value, it's just going to throw here a get function and get the data here so that we can just reflect here to get the current duration. So for that case, I think we have finished. So another problems which we had is just inside here, our home screen. So we can just navigate here because those buttons, when the title was big, it's just going to push those buttons there. So we can just navigate inside this bottom bar player. And now we can check here inside our artist information, because this is just the thing which has a problem that is just going to push the data. And we can just navigate inside this audio here. And as you can see here, we have not used this modifier, and here we created a new modifier. So these are just human errors. So we can just pass in here a modifier so that it can use this modifier. And here we are just passing here a weight in order to limit this. And we are doing this because this modifier here is just scoped inside here a row. So if we try to pass in a weight without passing this modifier inside here, we're just going to get the error because we are not having access to get that weight. Okay, so I think here let's try to rerun again and see if this has fixed our problems. Okay, now let's test again our application if we don't have any errors. So we can just navigate here and try to get this item. And as you can see here now, our progress is moving, and we can easily control here our progress. We can navigate to the next item here, and also we can just easily pause. And even if we have something with a big title here, as you can see, this is just going to be scoped to another problems here. And we don't navigate to the first item here because we restricted this to just stop if we reach the last item inside our playing items here. Okay, also if we navigate off, and our application is just going to control, and here we can easily even control our application. And finally, our app has launched successfully. That was epic. Congratulations for finishing this series. If you have found value out of these videos, please provide a like and don't forget to subscribe so we can just code together. So let's leave it here, guys. See you in the next video. Bye bye for now.